Welcome to the November 9th, 2010 meeting of the Glendale Housing Authority. May we have a roll call, please?
Authority members Draymond.
Here.
Friedman.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Parazian.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chair Quintero.
Here. May we have your report?
Agenda for the November 9th, 2010 regular meeting of the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, November 4th, 2010 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
What's next?
Next item is oral communications. There are no minutes for approval for this meeting. The next item is oral communications. Discussion is limited to items not part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. Members of the Housing Authority may question or respond to a speaker, but there will be no debate or decision, and the matter may be referred to staff through the Executive Director for investigation and a report. One card was submitted.
Actually, the one card is for agenda item 6A. You have one?
Clarification. No, then
Okay.
it is for 6A. I apologize.
All right. Next, please.
Then 6A on the business agenda is Director of Community Redevelopment and Housing regarding Housing Authority policy, considering report for affordable housing development, consideration of. 6A1 is motion to note and file report and provide direction to staff.
Mr. Starberg.
Mr. Chair, I'll go to Phil Lanzafame, Director of Community Redevelopment and Housing.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Housing Authority, we are here to get direction on a policy of whether we should buy or build in increasing our affordable housing stock. In 2001, well, first let me back up and say in the law, the redevelopment agency and housing authorities are charged with advancing, improving, and increasing affordable housing in the state of California. In 2001, the Housing Authority adopted a strategy whereby we did two things. First, we sent out a statement of interest to solicit developers to come in and build. We also, in that strategy, identified properties that we wanted to acquire and develop affordable housing. We acquired 6 properties, 5 of which have been developed, and we are now at the last property, which is 5th and Sonora. Recently, staff was before you looking for direction on how to finish out that last property when this issue of buy versus build came up. Is it better, more efficient to buy units, or is it more efficient to build units? And so we prepared this report for you today. It's really in 3 elements. You have invested in property is one element that you need to consider when you are giving us direction on this. The second is just straight economics, and we've tried to put an analysis together that will compare the different ways to gain affordable housing. And then third are some non-financial considerations to keep into account or take into account as you move forward with this policy. And I would just let you know again, we own the piece of property at 5th and Sonora. That investment has been made. It is included, though, that cost of land is included in the subsidy, per unit subsidy that we've looked at in these examples. With that, we may have one other property on Salem Street that the Housing Authority may take possession of, and would be another property that you have money invested in as part of your consideration. So with that, I'm going to invite Tim Mulren from Tierra West Associates to walk through the economics and the different assumptions that he's made and go through that exercise on the cost of the different scenarios.
Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Tim Mulrennan, Tierra West Advisor, Economic Advisor to the Redevelopment Agency and the Housing Authority. And you have a copy of the PowerPoint that we're about to go through. And there was quite a bit of analysis that went into this. And so if we can continue on, Artie, can we get to the next slide, please? First thing, when we're talking about affordable housing, it's helpful to know who our customers are. We're generally talking about extremely low-income households who earn up to 30% of area median income, which for a household of 3 would be up to $22,400 a year. Our very low-income households earn up to 50% of area median income, which for a family of 3 is up to $37,300. Lower income households earn up to 80% of area median income, which for a family of 3 is $56,700. And for our moderate income households, they earn between 81% and 120% of area median income, which is up to $68,50 for a family of 3. What can they pay? Under a renter-occupied scenario where they're taking apartments, extremely lows can pay $425 a month, and very low $709, lower $851, moderates up to $1559, and under owner-occupied, for extremely low and very low, it's the same amount. But you have an opportunity to increase it slightly for the lower and moderate to $992 and $1819 a month. Now, these are not rents, they're not mortgage payments, these are total housing costs, which include utilities for your renters, and for your homeowners, they also include taxes, homeowners association, insurance, and maintenance, anything that goes along with owning a house. Marty? For the examples that we're going to look at together this afternoon, we've looked at new construction of multifamily, which is what most of our experience has been in the last few years, purchasing condominiums on the market on a one-off, one unit at a time basis, purchase foreclosed condominiums, purchase smaller apartments of 2 to 4 units, or purchasing larger apartment projects, which are greater than 10 units. And for the most part, we're talking about 2-bedroom units in the numbers that we are going to be looking at together today, because the numbers I showed you earlier for a 3-person household, these numbers change for household size, for apartment numbers, so we're trying to give you an average rather than bury you with the details. Marty? Under our new construction multifamily scenario, we looked at 2 scenarios, one developing under the HUD 202 program, which is for seniors, and a very attractive part of the HUD 202 program is, in addition to getting capital assistance on the front end for the construction of the project, you also get project-based vouchers, which covers the difference between what the tenants can pay, which is 30% of their income, and the operating expenses of the project. There's no cash flow in HUD 202 projects. Basically, all of the cash flow goes to cover operating expenses. There's nothing remaining for debt service. And then the other scenario we looked at, which is one that you're familiar with, it's the 9% low-income tax credit scenario, where these can be for seniors, families, special needs. In today's examples, we're going to assume we're building it for families. And the difference with the HUD 202 program is that the tax credit projects have to carry themselves. We can't count on vouchers to help with paying mortgage payments or operating expenses. Artie? In the HUD 202 example that we're going to look at together today, the Fifth and Sonora property is, we're going to use that as an example. We're going to assume that we're going to build 53 units on the project. We've already purchased the land for $6 million, which, if we built the 53 units, comes to $113,000 a unit. Now, HUD 202 program is for seniors. In our examples, these were all 1-bedroom units. The parking on this was based, I assumed 1 stall per bedroom, which allowed us to avoid subterranean parking and park it at grade, which reduces the cost to make it more financially attractive. Artie, and in this case, we've also looked at owner-occupied units. In this case, we looked at the market research found that over the last 6 months, we had 80 units, mostly 2 bedrooms, as we looked at earlier. The least expensive was $240,000. The maximum was $855,000. We averaged about $472,000. That was a market rate house. I stand corrected in the first column. The second column is for our condominiums. Again, for the same 6-month period, there were more sales. There were 102 sales. They ranged from $190,000 to $670,000 per unit, and they averaged $323,000 a unit. We also looked at condominiums in foreclosure, and we found that in looking at the foreclosures, we considered anything that was in default. So if it went back to the bank, we counted that. If it had a notice of trustee sale filed against it or a notice of default, which is documents that get recorded before the bank takes it back, we considered those too. And so we were picking up a lot of projects that were underwater, where the loans against those houses or those condos were more than the fair market value of the property. And so in that case, the least expensive unit we found was $203,000, the most expensive $402,000, and the average was $322,000. So on the average, the deals in default were coming in at about the same price as the condos. We also looked at buying some basically 2 to 4 unit properties. We found that under the 6-month period we looked at, there were 22 deals that sold. On a dollars per unit basis, the prices ranged from $133 to $325, averaging $221,000 a unit. And we looked at 2 to 4 unit properties that were in foreclosure. In our sample that we looked at, we found 6 properties. These were sales that were projected to close in the July to October 2010 time period. These deals went into default at the second half of 2009 generally. And we found on these deals they ranged from $166 a unit to $372,000 a unit, averaging $271. So again, you're seeing that they're more expensive than the deals you can find on the market, because again, we're considering deals that are in default, that have not gone back to the bank yet, and they're underwater. They owe more on the notes than the property's worth. And then on the large multifamily foreclosures, before I discuss this slide, I should say that we also looked at larger apartment projects that sold in Glendale. We don't have a slide for that. I apologize. It didn't make it into the presentation. But we found 14 deals that closed that averaged about $135,000 a unit. So we're going to use that as a sample as we discuss the larger apartment projects. Now, on our large multifamily foreclosures, we did not find many multifamily foreclosures that have gone through the process. However, we did turn up 2 samples that have not gone back to the bank yet. They seem to be negotiating between the borrower and the lender. 224 South Jackson's a mixed-use project, involves some commercial space, and the loans are approximately $342,000 a unit. It's not completed yet. I put in an allowance of about $50,000 a unit. The inside is basically shell. You'd have to finish out the interior. And if the housing authority were to take that over, you need to consider construction defect liability with any condominium deals. We also found 412 East Broadway is a multifamily, 115 units. That loan, according to foreclosure.com, was at approximately $48.7 million, or almost $423,000 a unit. So again, these are deals that may go back to the bank because of the high loan balances outstanding, and somebody looking to invest in these may find that they're trying to get a discount on the note or buying it at a lower price. This is a summary of the findings. We've kind of crunched them together here, and I've got a slide that'll follow up, which is perhaps a little bit more legible. But you have a copy of this. It's basically indicating that on our new construction, under our HUD 202 program over here on the left, you can see that we can bring those in at about $198,000 to $184,000 a unit, depending upon the households that we're targeting, whether they're extremely low or very low. The HUD 202 program is not for lower or moderate. And some of the assumptions that we took into consideration at the bottom of the page, again, $113,000 a unit. So, for example, under that extremely low income example under a HUD 202 program, $113,000 of that $198,000 is in the land already. So you've got another $85,000 or so in fresh cash that it would take to bring that project in. So that of that $198,000 at the top, that's including the land of $113,000 a unit. And again, some of our assumptions are at the bottom. The 9% tax credit project, we've run some numbers to give you a comparison on that. If we were to do them on all extremely low, it'd cost $261,000 a unit in assistance. And part of that is because under extremely low income households, they really don't pay enough rent to cover the operating expenses of the project. And so the Housing Authority would need to put in additional funds to help that project meet its operating expense requirements year to year. So that's a challenge on an operating basis, whereas under the HUD 202 program with the project-based vouchers, you were getting assistance annually to cover the operating expenses. Under the if all of the units were under the 9% project were leased to very low-income households, those at 50% of area median income, the assistance per unit would be $224,000 a unit, and if they were all at low, they'd be about $203,000 a unit. A typical tax credit scenario is a mix of households, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, and we did a run on that. It's not on your chart, I apologize, but it came in at about $200,000 a unit, and under a family project, that would have been with a subterranean parking. We assumed larger bedroom sizes, 2 and 3 bedroom, versus the HUD 202 was a 1 bedroom, and a parking ratio of 1 stall per bedroom. So there's some moving pieces in that you need to be aware of. If we go to the next slide, which is our alternatives for buying existing units, you can see on the left that if you were to buy a market rate condominium for about $325,000, again, our assumptions are down at the bottom of the page, and you put in about $25,000 a unit to rehab the project, all in, your assistance per unit would range from about $346,000 for an extremely low-income household down to $139,000 for a moderate. And again, with the extremely low, they have a difficult time with their income covering the expenses of a project. As we moved over to the foreclosed condominiums, we assumed the same purchase price, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But we assume that even when you took the property back, that there might be some people still living in the project. There have been stories about residents continuing to live in a unit after the bank takes them back, and some of the investors have had to get into a cash for keys program where they're actually paying people to move out. And in the case of the Housing Authority, you'd need to pay relocation assistance. So in that case, I assumed that for each household, you'd have to pay about $20,000 to move them out. 50% chance somebody'd be in there, so we averaged $10,000 a unit for relocation on that. Also assumed that it would be in worse shape than a market rate unit, so we allowed for more money for rehab, $30,000 a unit versus $25,000, and we assumed we'd have additional legal costs with the whole relocation process and the foreclosure. So we assumed $5,000 a unit on that. And so on a foreclosed condominium, it was basically costing us more than it would if we were to buy on the market. However, if you remember my earlier slide when we were talking about the units that were on the market, these were the average prices, $325,000 a unit plus or minus. Where at the lower end of the range, we were seeing units down around the low twos, $2 to $250. And so if you were to take an opportunistic approach and pick up the least expensive ones, we could save some money from the numbers that we're talking about here. As we move to the right side of the chart where we're talking about the small multifamilies, as I mentioned, the smaller, the duplex, the fourplex kind of properties, we're selling at an average of about $225,000. We assumed we'd have to do some relocation for some of them. Again, we assumed the 50%, and so we averaged about $10,000 a unit on relocation. We assumed $30,000 a unit fix-up cost, assuming some site work in there, as well as rehabbing the exterior and the interior of the unit. We assumed $5,000 a unit in legal fees because of the relocation, and so our assistance per unit on the 2 to 4 unit smaller properties was ranging from $295,000 a unit for the extremely low income households down to $177,000 a unit for the moderates. and with the very low and the lows coming in at $241,000 and $218,000 per unit, respectively. And then for our large rental units, as I mentioned earlier, we were finding them averaging at about $135,000 a unit. So we assumed if we were picking them up at about $150,000 a unit, spent $10,000 a unit on relocation, another $27,500 for rehab and site work, interior and exterior, and $2,500 on legal. So we're assuming a little economies of scale on this compared to the duplexes and fourplexes. We felt we could deliver on an agency assistance per unit basis ranging from $215,000 a unit down to $75,000 a unit for the extremely low going to the moderates, with the very low and lows coming in at $162,000 and $139,000 a unit, respectively. So if you remember our larger chart, these large multifamily properties can be very competitive for us in buying these on an opportunistic basis, rehabbing them, and turning them up for very low or low-income households compared to our current programs of building new construction. So our next page, Artie, which is our conclusion, generally, new construction is more cost-effective for the Housing Authority for extremely low, very low, and lower-income households, and that's because of the leverage you can get with the tax credits and with the HUD 202 program. There are also other sources of assistance we've used in our program, such as City of Industry Affordable Housing Program. However, there is a wide range in prices on existing units, the multifamilies, the condos, and so if we could pick them up at the lower end of the range, we could make a dent in the numbers that I've shared with you today, and they could come in better than this. Buying and rehabbing existing larger apartment projects may be cost effective for us at lower and moderate income households, but again, the moderate income rents are above market right now, so you're basically building market rate if you were to put it all towards moderate income households. And you may want to consider an option to pursue opportunistic buying of existing units, perhaps large multifamily or on a case-by-case basis, condominiums for moderates, and providing affordable housing through that mechanism as an additional tool in your quiver for meeting your affordable housing needs. With that, I'll turn it over to Peter Zovak for the non-financial implications of this consideration. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the authority, in terms of non-fiscal benefits to the methodology of buying, in terms of land use impact, buying in most cases has little or no impact to existing land uses as the number of units in a project remains the same. Preservation of existing housing stock, buying does retain the existing housing resources. It does promote the strengthening of neighborhoods, providing healthy neighborhoods by providing decent, safe, and sanitary housing. Helps reducing the reduction of overcrowding as occupancy standards and management practices are improved. It could provide and allow for more innovative follow-up considerations to be taken up at a later time, such as a smart rehabilitation code, which would help promote and facilitate future rehabilitation. In terms of time frame, buying does allow for a product to come online much quicker than a build scenario. Going over to the non-fiscal benefits of build, they do increase the overall supply of affordable housing with the city versus buying of existing market rate units. Available properties, there may be some competition with potential buyers in the buy scenario that might make buying a little bit more difficult, but not necessarily impossible. Under community development, we have buying provides an opportunity for the Housing Authority to participate and the community in the development of a property within the city. It's also a catalyst to the community in terms of new development and new investment, and possibly in an underserved neighborhood. Neighborhood amenities building will allow for opportunities to provide additional amenities such as open space, community gardens, and other examples that we've had in previous new construction projects. There are improvements to vacant land under the vacant acquisition scenario. Helps with the reduction and elimination of blight. Helps additional assistance with leveraging of outside resources, new creation of jobs through the construction, and allows, under new development, under the build scenario, allows for social service programming as what we see in the tax credit projects. So we presented what we think is the methodology and discussion points of the buy versus build. As Tim Mulrennan had mentioned, in certain circumstances there are some advantages to buying over building. Staff sees it as another potential tool that the authority can add to its arsenal in developing future affordable housing projects. From this point forward, the staff plans to come back on December 16th, I believe, to provide a discussion on how future affordable housing developers, projects could be identified, analyzed, and how best to go about processing the different options and proposals that are being presented to the authority, given the funding that we have, given the Housing Authority objectives, and the timeframes that may be out there.
Questions for the staff at this point? All right, thank you. I have one card, Mike Mohill.
Good afternoon, Chairman Quintero and council members. My name is Mike Mohill, long-term resident of Glendale. I'm always glad to help the underdog, and this housing is a nice way of doing it. I'm just concerned about oversight. We've had a couple of bad situations recently. Mrs. Rose Sharp with her New Horizon project, and more recently ADI. Are we going to have good oversight on these housing projects that we're looking at? Parking is always a problem that I see. These areas that we're going to have apartments, converted apartments to whatever. Are we going to have enough parking and parks, open space for the residents? Can we take some of this land and just tear down the building and make it a giant parking lot for the people in the area? Because I'm sure a lot of these areas are high density of population, and there's no street parking. Some of the problems that were created back in the 70s and the 80s. Again, open space would be nice. Many parks, whatever it takes. It concerns me that it costs more money to convert an old building to be affordable than a new building to be created. I don't see the math on that. I must be missing something. And as far as updating an old building, if you're living in your car, any type of housing is better than living in a car. So do we need to have a top-of-the-line apartment for someone who's looking for affordable housing? Again, I like helping my brother. And again, thank you for your time.
You. Okay, any comments? Mayor Najarian.
A couple questions. Mr. Starbird, have you read this report?
Yes.
And do you feel that it's a thorough and comprehensive analysis of the issues?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One issue that I have a couple issues. I think that the prices that were represented as per unit cost for multifamily apartments are overstated. I've got a list, and this is from my local realtor. I said, please run the apartment buildings that are for sale or that have sold. And almost without exception, they're right about the $200,000 per unit. So I think that the survey that was done may be a little bit on the high side. Those are both buildings below 10 units and over 10 units. In the analysis, I didn't see if the city buys an apartment building and the cost is authority assistance. I'm looking at your summary of findings. $215,000 for a very low rental unit. Are we not collecting rent from that unit as well? I think we are collecting rent, a reduced rent to make
We
it
would.
affordable.
That's correct.
I mean, where is that in this analysis, that there is an income stream, albeit a reduced income stream? I don't see that. I don't think that was discussed or addressed. So I think the actual value then, when you look at the authority assistance, that is an overstated amount because you're not factoring in an income stream. There's going to be management expenses, clearly. That's 5% to 10%. But you're going to be having an income stream coming in. So I don't see where that's in there. I think if you factor that in, the actual assistance to the from the authority is going to be very low. In fact, it is also an opportunity for a partner, for a management company to come in and to invest with the city to both manage and to collect the rents and reduce the ultimate authority assistance per unit. I mean, my goal in bringing this up is when I looked at some of those very high per unit subsidies that we were giving, it was I think, incumbent on us to look for the purchase option for these existing buildings that are, many of them are not more than 20 years old. They appear to be in very good shape throughout all parts of the city. Not to mention the issue of the oversight, the issue of trusting your development partner in developing the low-income housing, not to mention the hours and hours of staff time that goes in to analyzing these projects, reporting to the authority, going back and forth with the authority on what we want, what the developer wants, and the course of construction as well. And in the end, we're really holding our breath. We're hoping that the building turns out the way we hoped it would. We're hoping that none of the features are offensive. We're hoping that stucco doesn't crack, and we're hoping that there's enough parking, et cetera. It's also a matter of sustainability. We are not just throwing out and reusing. We are reusing existing housing stock and making it better for the community. So, go back to Mr. Starper. Did I miss, was the issue of the rents and how we would deal with the rents somehow in here and I didn't see it, or it was not supposed to be part of the presentation? Or
Well, let me ask our consultant to speak to that, but let me preface his remarks by saying that the question that you've posed and that you all are now pondering, I will tell you right now is one of the hottest topics in the affordable housing community. The largest agencies in the state are discussing the same very topic. In fact, our consultant was at a recent meeting where issues of cost and the likes were being discussed among the housing administrators in the largest cities in the state of California and some of the most prominent. So because the cost of providing affordable housing has continued to increase and is getting more and more expensive, and the desire of these people isn't to build new housing. The desire is to provide units. And I want to say that our interest here isn't in trying to justify that we should build new. It really is looking at honestly at what is the best approach, because our interest, I think your goal, is to provide as many units as you can. But this whole topic, what I've learned by listening to some of these people, is it's also, the economics is very complex, because it isn't just as simple as buying a unit versus building a unit, and then once it's built or once it's bought, that's it. There's the nature of the people that you're servicing, the social services support that goes into it, servicing these units. There is the cost of the local agency versus the combined cost of a unit, and that plays into it. buying a unit, you don't qualify for some of these dollars that you can leverage. So it means it's all local dollars for the most part that have to be spent, as opposed to spending other people's money to provide local units, and all of that comes into play. But why don't we let our consultant respond to your specific question, Mr. Mayor?
Mr. Najarian, we did review the market, and we found that the existing units were selling for about $135,000 a unit on the average. And Artie, if you could please open up that PowerPoint and go to slide number 25, if you could. What we did find is that on the larger multifamily projects, and we found about 14 sold in the go to the next slide, please, Artie. These are the supporting documents that are in the back.
These are slides you didn't receive, but we thought your questioning might go in this area, so it's more detail if they had slides.
Yeah, we didn't want to. We could bury you in the detail, and we didn't want to do that. But this is the math that we used to arrive at the numbers that are in your chart. And on our larger multifamily project, we found in our survey that we were buying them for about, for the last year, they were selling at an average of about $135,000 a unit. So we assumed that we would purchase them for about $150,000 a unit. Then we assumed rehab and soft costs of $40,000 a unit, so that we'd be all into the project at about $190,000 a unit. Up at the top, that EL stands for extremely low, going across, very low, low, and moderate. And as you go from left to right, the tenants can afford to pay more money. So we're in at a total cost of $190,000 a unit, and the effective price to the buyer, and I'll come to that with another slide, is that based upon what an investor would pay for the net income of the project after operating expenses, as I mentioned earlier, extremely low households do not pay enough to cover operating expenses, so you'd have to give them $25,000 and take and be into it for $215,000 under the extremely low income category. And as we move from left to right, servicing extremely low, very low, low, and moderate, our assistance per unit goes from $215 to $161, $138, and $75 for the respective households. And under that rehab and soft cost, we've got a footnote down there that we're assuming $27.5 per unit on rehab costs, including interior, exterior, and site work. We're assuming $10,000 per unit for relocation costs, assuming 50% of the people would not qualify for our restrictions, and we'd have to relocate them, and that we'd have about $2,500 a unit in legal costs. If you could go to the previous slide, please, Artie. That effective price to the buyer is what I want to get to now. In an earlier slide, we talked about what our customers could pay for these units, and under extremely low, their total housing costs were, after utilities, were $325, and going to the very low, $656, $798, and $1347 per unit per month. This is not a lot of money. And if you back out operating expenses of $458 a unit, except for the moderate, and that jumped up to $615, because if you're providing units to extremely low, very low, and anyone at or below 60% of area median income, you qualify for a welfare exemption from the obligation to pay property taxes. That welfare exemption goes away when you're dealing with people at the moderate income category. So in our projections, we assumed higher operating expenses to pay property taxes. And as a result, you'd have a net operating income, a negative $1,700, almost $1,800 for extremely low, going up to $7,900 a unit per year. We assumed a capitalization rate of 7%. That is, we assumed that once the Housing Authority fixed the property up, they would sell it to an investor who, on an all-cash basis, would earn a 7% return on their capital. Now, whether that's high or not, but we assumed that we could sell it to a nonprofit at a 7 cap. Income properties are sold on a capitalization rate where if you take your net operating income, which is your cash flow before debt service, you divide that net operating income by the price and you get a cap rate. So in other words, generally, if somebody bought a property at a 7% cap rate, they'd be getting an annual dividend of about 7%. So we assumed that we could sell it to investors. Well, we'd have to give them $25,000 to take the extremely low income project, but the values then went up to $28,51 and $114,000 a unit respectively, and that's how we got to the values of those properties and the subsidies per unit that we discussed on the previous page. And we've got similar math for the fourplexes and the similar approach to arriving at a value. Sticking with this slide here, there is, I think nonprofits and property managers will certainly be interested in having the business of running an apartment project for you. And again, in this case, we're assuming that an investor, a co-investor, a partner would invest with us on the basis that they were getting a 7% per year return on their money. So in this case, we would have a partner that's getting a return on their capital. Hopefully I've addressed your question, Mr. Najarian.
If I can just add, I had a meeting just this week with a market rate housing developer. Good quality developer, does quite a bit of housing. And they indicated that their expected rate of return is about 10.5%. His comment was they won't do a project unless they can achieve a 10.5% rate of return. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to affordable, but in the for-market housing arena, that was his take, that a developer would expect about a 10.5% return.
Well, and if we were to run this at a 10.5%, the values would be less than what I'm giving you here.
Right.
Thank you.
10.5% is out of this world, personally. What I've seen,
Just what we were told.
I think 7% is pretty high as well. Are there any realtors in the room? Can I enlist a realtor? I won't do that at this time, but I think a lot of these assumptions are off. I'll just put it at that. I think the monthly operating expenses are high. I think the cap rate projection is high. I think our obligation as a housing authority is to provide as much clean and safe housing to the public as possible. And that doesn't mean brand spanking new. That doesn't mean freshly built with the latest appliances, but clean and safe and, number one, affordable housing to the public. And I think that our current path of going through, identifying property, doing bids, getting contractors in, developers, going through the whole rigmarole, holding our breath. Are they going to get the 9%? Are they going to get the 7%? What kind of programs are they going to have in there? I think we're on the wrong track, and that worked maybe at some point in the past, but I think we have to look immediately towards, and I've got a list, and any realtor in town will give you a list of move-in condition apartments that are recently built, and that we can immediately begin to provide assistance to the public, and that the public, as we all know, is literally crying for help with for the housing. We, if I can use a transportation analogy, we don't need to be providing them with BMWs. They just need a car to get around in. A Toyota or a Chevy is just going to be fine. I just think I appreciate the analysis. I think in the end you're saying that buying a larger multifamily project, apartment building is efficient, makes sense. I think we have to get on this right away. I'm tired, frankly, I'm tired of going through what we go through every time we try and get a brand new project in, and it costs us an arm and a leg to do it. And it takes us 18 months to get it done. There are bargains to be had in the marketplace, and we need to act on it quickly, and there's cash flow available in this, depending on how we structure it. Let's just get away from this. Let's build it, and not to mention all the other problems that dealing with this has done. And frankly, it just hasn't been worth the headache for me dealing with new construction and new development when we've got this sitting right in our own backyard, ready to go, ready to move in. Thank you, Mr.
Okay, I'll make my comments and then go to you, Ms. Friedman. Well, I do think this was worth exploring, and let me say, when I first was elected, I believe in 2001, I advocated this same approach. There are buildings in this city that we could rehab, fairly modern buildings built in, say, the last 15 to 20 years, and I do think it's a reasonable tool that we need to make as part of our tool chest. Now, I've been actively involved in real estate. I got my license in the 1970s. I was actively involved in the market in the early 80s when there were multiple opportunities in Glendale with that real estate collapse. I haven't really seen that in this recession, which I found kind of interesting. A few years ago, I was convinced that there were going to be an awful lot of projects that were upside down. Well, thank God that, in fact, that hasn't been the case. So I'm not sure that there are that many good deals worth pursuing. However, there's no question that we need to take a look, and the staff needs to be actively involved to try to find some, because it is a much cheaper, let's call it that way, it's a much cheaper way to provide affordable housing. Then the caveat there is that some of the people that we're displacing are treated properly, whether they're allowed to go back into the project. It's a very complex situation. You have people living in these apartment buildings. Years ago, they were normally projects that were in foreclosure and never occupied. It would have been a lot easier. But this time around, there's going to be an awful lot of tenants living in these properties, and they do have to be handled reasonably and accommodated, because sometimes their kids are in the local school. Now you have to move them out. They have to find another apartment while they're waiting to get back into their regular apartment, or they don't qualify at all for whatever reason. So it's not so easily done. However, it's something that we need to pursue. I agree 100%. And it only took 9 years to have this discussion, so I'm heartened by the conversation today. And I do think it has to be a mix of both. There's a lot to be said for new housing and the kind of things that you can do in neighborhoods and parks and gardens and so forth, but on the other hand, it is extremely, extremely costly. So I think we have to balance both. Ms. Friedman.
Well, first, I don't quite understand why Mayor Najarian's putting down Toyotas. As a Honda owner, I happen to like it, and I wouldn't trade it for a BMW. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe I would. I'm just kidding. And no, I thank the mayor for bringing this forward. It's a very interesting discussion and something that we should absolutely continue looking into. And we should look at a couple of opportunity sites as we move forward and run the analysis. My big concern is the lack of federal subsidy and how that would end up penciling out. I mean, that's really my biggest concern in this, is if we're sort of going it alone, do we end up paying more as a city than we would if we were building new? And also, we have to look at the buildings, obviously, on a case-by-case basis. Some of them might be too substandard for affordable housing. They may not have any open space at all. Some of the buildings from the 70s and 80s didn't. They're just big, giant boxes. And affordable housing tends to, at least the ones that we've built, tends to have a lot of children and young families. So that type of building might not be appropriate for a family, lower income. It might be for senior, though. So, as Mr. Quintero said, it's going to be a complicated thing, but I think we should absolutely look into it. And as we move forward, as we start to evaluate sites and projects we're looking at around town, we can certainly look at the available housing stock and see what that would take and how it all pencils out in the end. So I thank the staff and the consultant for bringing forward such an intricate analysis. And it is interesting, and it's interesting to hear also from Mr. Starbird that other agencies are looking at this as well. And it could be that the tide is turning somewhat. And if there's opportunity to be had in this economy, we should certainly take advantage of it. So thank you, Mr. Najarian.
Any other comments or questions? Mr. Draymond?
No questions, but just a comment or two. We absolutely need to pursue this further. Absolutely. There is no reason not to, first of all. Secondly, when we sit here on the dais at a housing authority meeting and we see a project that's being pitched to us that describes the cost per unit for some affordable housing on the low end of over $300,000 per unit and on the high end over $500,000 per unit, I'm not convinced that that is a good deal. And I don't think the public thinks that's a good deal. And I don't know how you justify some of that when there are buildings that would be perfectly adequate. And again, I appreciate the fact that in the PowerPoint there was some reference to smart codes, or put another way, alternative building codes to deal with some of the issues of rehab. Remember that purchasing these buildings is also doing something else. It's aside from just the affordable housing aspect of it and providing affordable units, it's also putting money out into the community as well. You're purchasing a property. Those funds don't just stop. They don't go into the owner's pocket and just sit there. That owner is then doing something with those dollars. So I think we're contributing in that way as well. It's true, we're not putting people to work, so to speak, or facilitating people going to work in terms of building a new building. But I also think that this sustainability issue is a big factor also. We are not using new natural resources to build these buildings, and we're not causing an entire neighborhood to go through the upheaval and tumult, if you will, of a construction project in their backyard. We're not running new electrical service. We're not running new gas service. We're not running new water service. So, and we're not increasing the need for providing new water consumers and so on. So I don't think that this will or should replace in its entirety new construction or affordable housing. But this should be, and I think it can be, a very good secondary component. And so I think we need to look at this with a different eye. The eye should be to how can we make this work for Glendale, not just what are the comparable numbers when we take a quick glance at it and say we think it will or we think it won't. If we're serious about this, if my colleagues are serious about this, we should give direction to staff to look at this and say, are there specific niches or whole areas where existing buildings could be made to work, and how do we make it work for Glendale? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any other
Yeah, I'd like
comments?
to say something.
Yeah. Mr. Weaver.
I've had a lot of numbers thrown at me, no offense, but I could not digest everything like my colleagues could. I'm willing to consider it as a tool, an additional tool. I don't know the ramifications. I need way more information on a case-by-case basis if this makes sense or it doesn't. It's a tool. So when an opportunity comes, I want to look at it from different factors. How old is the housing stock that we're looking at? What is the condition of the housing stock? Is it going to require seismically upgrading? Is it going to require, and this is built on our new codes, building codes, are we going to have to change the electrical in one apartment in a complex, which seems impossible to me? Is there adequate parking? Does it meet the current parking standards? There's too many apartments in this city already that don't have parking. We're going to sell one unit in it. Where's the parking? In other words, it's not as simple as it looks. It's been said. It's complicated. It's a tool. Maybe it'll work in certain cases. My 14 years here, first one on. I remember Sheldon Baker sitting here as a councilman, pushing for more home ownership, more housing, and we're still talking about that. I'm glad to hear the state's looking at it. Maybe they can come up with some bright ideas. Are you going to do this in old housing stock? I'll go along with the tool, but I need a lot more on an individualized basis to determine if we should do it. Thank you.
I agree that this should be added to our arsenal. The one thing that we're talking about low-income housing, and many of these projects might be a 1 or 2 unit situation, and we're trying to get as many people that need housing so desperately into affordable housing, and that's where the larger one where we might be able to take care of 60 people instead of 1 or 2. But it should be added. If we are looking, I think the staff ought to be looking for these projects, and when they have, we ought to consider it.
Okay, any other comments? Mr. Starbird.
Well, I'd like to leave here having a better sense of, I think, a next step. Obviously, there's interest on your part. I think our next step should be for the staff either to bring you back a process for finding something out there that we can utilize along these lines of finding existing, whether it's large or small rehab or foreclosure, and let's see what it takes to take one of these on. We still have Fifth and Sonora we have to come back and talk about, because there we've already bought the land. So unless we're going to sell it and use those resources, we have to do something with that. But in the meantime, and maybe as we come back with that, I'd like to talk some more about, okay, what's a good next step here to begin to explore this field of doing rehab, purchase existing with rehab, whether it's going to be rental or ownership, and get from you some steps you'd like us to take so we can begin to try this on, rather than just have it sit out there and then wondering when we're going to actually utilize it.
No, I think that's exactly what we have to do. What's the process going to be, even for a property owner,
Right.
commercial agents that want to... But let me say once again, in terms of Sonora, I want to look at affordable housing for veterans, not just the returning veterans from the Gulf Wars, but older veterans, disabled veterans, et cetera. So, I mean, that's specifically what we've been talking about, and I want to continue to explore those issues. It doesn't have anything to do with this, but...
Mr. Chairman, it dawned on us that one thing we want to make sure we clarify, and we can bring it up more as we come back with this process, because we do think in the analysis that there are some benefits. The Housing Authority can't own the property. We're precluded from doing that. So that process would include us acquiring the property and then finding somebody to sell it to who would operate it for that cash flow. It has to do with public housing, Title 32, I believe, and a vote that Glendale took some time ago to preclude us from doing that. But it's something that we can put into the process, and the numbers would remain the same, and the analysis would remain the same.
Starburn.
Just on that, there may be owners who want to partner with us, who own some units, want to have them rehab, converted to low income, partner with us so they end up being the owner. So there's a number of different ways we can look at this. It doesn't necessarily, I think, have to be we acquire, we rehab, and then we sell it. As was noted, you can go into this with a partner. And it may be an existing owner. And maybe we need to go out and find out in the community, are there brokers, are there owners that may have properties that they want to come in and sit down and talk to us about. But your staff will take some time and come up with some options that we can consider in the very near future.
Mr. Container, I think we'd get more out of it if you go find a project. Trying to sit here and figure out how we're going to go through the process until we actually do one. We'll learn the process as we go through it. I mean, I think we'll get more out of it that way. Bring something forth, and then we'll start delving into the problems. We'll say, yeah, okay, we learned this, we learned that, but I don't know how we're going to sit here as 5 individuals with staff and learn the whole process. It's something new. We haven't done it. So go find one. Find a partner, whatever. Start tackling it and see if it'll work.
7 individuals. I'll just point to drain.
I was going to suggest as a next step that we do what we do often, and that is direct staff to go find some, rather than academic or theoretical conclusions, to actually go out and take the show on the road and talk to some of the people in our own community who are in the business of apartment houses, condominiums, etc., deal with foreclosures, who deal with sale of properties like this, and see where the theory and the fact come together. And there may be suggestions as to how to deal with some of that will come to light at that point. But I don't think we're going to find out unless we go out and talk to the professionals in the community. And so that would be my direction as a next step, Mr. Chair, would be to talk to some of the professionals in our own city. I mean, Glendale is, if nothing else, and has always been a real estate and retail community. So I don't think we'll have any trouble finding those in the community who are willing to help and give advice or some guidance or some suggestions.
Okay, any other comments? Laura?
And I think for the coming home veterans, we could just look for the new constructions in the city. And so if we start building new apartments, it will take time. But the veterans are coming back soon, so we need to have something. And we just need to look for any possibility to buy all those houses, the buildings that were built in the city.
All right, Mr. Starbird. Okay. Thank you very much. Excellent discussion.
You want a motion? Or?
I don't think a motion is necessary.
It isn't. It was just a note and file and provide direction if the Housing Authority.
I think your interest is very clear.
Okay, next, Mr. City Clerk.
Next is authority member or staff comments, and I believe there is one staff comment.
Good afternoon, Housing Authority members and Mr. Chair. My name is Sona Muradian, and I'm from the Housing Division. I'm here to talk about the Geneva project today, the marketing efforts. Affirmative marketing and outreach began in October 2010. Outreach activities and advertisements in the form of newspaper advertisements, public service announcements, and mailers were provided to the public in 5 languages: English, Armenian, Spanish, Korean, and Tagalog. Applications for the Geneva project will be distributed at pre-scheduled informational meetings. The first informational meeting was held on October 30th, where there were over 170 attendees. The remaining 3 informational meetings will all be held at the Glendale Police Community Room, located at 131 North Isabel Street. The meeting dates are on Wednesday, November 10 at 7 p.m., Saturday, November 13th at 10 a.m., and Thursday, November 18th at 7 p.m. Information about the scheduled informational meetings is also posted on the city's website at www.ci.glendale.ca.us. Families are required to attend one of these remaining 3 informational meetings in order to obtain an application and have all their questions answered before they can apply. The purpose of these meetings will be to explain the concept of Habitat for Humanity's housing program, show prospective applicants' conceptual plans of the Geneva development, and to have the city staff explain any special criteria with regards to income, documentation, and any title restrictions imposed by the use of city funds. The application deadline is December 3rd. Therefore, staff encourages families interested in the Geneva project to attend one of the 3 remaining informational meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next would be adjournment. Motion?
Move we adjourn.
Second.
We are adjourned.